Hello, my name is Daniel Fitzsimmons Cruz. This is a recorded lecture that we have for session 2 of this course. This lecture will highlight some of the major social and cultural history surrounding the Erie Canal. We'll also be taking a look at the decline of the canal and what it looks like today. These are some quick recaps from our lecture in the past session. They're some of the more important points that we talked about relating to economic gains from the canal. One thing to always remember is that the canal was immediately successful right after it opened. It did take a while for the canal to finish, it was 8 years, and it took what amounts to today's money would be around $200 million. It was around $7 million back then, but you've got to adjust for inflation. But right when it opened up, it became a big moneymaker for the state. They sold tickets in terms of passenger sales, and they also sold tolls for ships that would pass through the canal at the different lock points. It also drastically increased the amount of trade, not just in the areas around the Erie Canal, but also really across the entire state. The big one especially is New York City, with the Erie Canal basically connecting the Midwest of the United States, in particular Chicago, with a waterway directly to the East Coast with New York City. New York City became the busiest port in the United States, and it became the richest port as well. This is an additional slide recapping some of the ideas about the movement of people that we talked about last session. This is going to be a concept that becomes more important as the lecture goes on. One thing to really remember with the Erie Canal is that a big part of the workforce that built it were immigrants. Most of all were Irish immigrants. There were about 5,000 Irish immigrants that ended up building the Erie Canal, and a lot of them ended up settling in the towns that were established on the banks of the canal. And that's why today you see a large Irish population in central and western New York. It wasn't just the Irish, so there's a lot of immigrants, especially during this time period, that are coming to the United States and coming from the East Coast and moving west. And while a lot of them do stay in New York and settle in these new towns, a lot of them continue on their way and they go to the Midwest and occupy those regions. And even though they're no longer in New York, the Erie Canal still played a very big role in their lives, and they felt a connection to that. And that includes as well people that would continue to benefit economically from the Erie Canal, even though they're living in a place like Chicago or Detroit. They're still maybe with their business operating using the Erie Canal by sending goods over the Great Lakes to the Erie Canal to a place like New York City and sending it off. Kind of going off of that idea of different regions being connected, one of the biggest impacts that the canal had was on national unity. Yes, the canal did make a lot of money, and it was a fantastic engineering achievement, but it was more than just that. The success of the canal really helped unite the nation. One thing that's important to remember is that when the canal was completed in 1825, the U.S. had only been around as an independent country for about 50 years, so we were still very new. And we were still trying to find our footing in the world, and we're trying to prove ourselves to these established nations that have all this, great infrastructure and these big cities and connected areas, where a lot of our territory is still kind of, undeveloped, and we don't really have these national symbols yet that we eventually will have. And the Erie Canal becomes one of them. It's a very notable feature in the American landscape. It's the second largest canal in the entire world when it's completed. It's 363 miles. The only canal that's bigger would be in China, and that would be 1,000+ miles. That's a combination of a lot of different canals. But it became a big tourist attraction, the Erie Canal. A lot of people came to visit it, not just from different states, but also from different countries, especially Europeans that would come over and see the canal. Because of this, Americans started to feel a sense of pride in the canal. I mean, this was something that we created, and that was a momentous achievement that we wanted to show off and that we were proud of. So it became really a symbol of American identity. Kind of looking at identity as this abstract concept, one thing that people often forget is that, new forms of transportation as they pop up in history do more than just move physical objects. To us living in the 21st century, it might seem silly, but to the people of the 1800s, something like the canal was viewed almost the same as the internet. This is how people got information quickly from one place to another. Before that, you're relying on someone either walking or taking a horse ride there. And if you were to go to Buffalo to New York City, that would take you, 3-ish weeks. With the Erie Canal, you could do that in a week. So it really speeds up the movement of ideas as well as people and just goods in general. One of these ideas is women's rights. Right when the Erie Canal is starting to be finished and in the decades after, women's rights becomes a very big focal point for the United States. And one of the places where it really takes off is New York State. We tend to be a leader in a lot of these movements that happen in U.S. history, and women's rights is a great example of that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, they're two very important figures in New York State history, and they fight for women's rights to be treated as equal as men. One of the big things that a lot of people may be more familiar with would be suffrage, the right to vote. Places like Seneca Falls, which held the very famous Women's Rights Convention, was not a big city before the Erie Canal was built. The canal helped bring more people to this area and really establish the city as a prosperous place where people wanted to go. The same goes for a place like Rochester as well. And it's in these places where these movements, like the women's rights movements, can really take hold. Because you've got to remember, again, it's not just people that are moving, it's the ideas. And as these women go up and down the Erie Canal, they're preaching their demands for equality. They're sharing their declaration of sentiments, which denounce inequalities in property rights, education, employment, religion, marriage and family, and suffrage. The Declaration of Sentiments is basically the Declaration of Independence, but with some lines changed where instead of, for example, saying all men are created equal, it's saying all men and women are created equal. While there may be not, the clearest connection between the Erie Canal and women's rights, again, you've got to remember, before the Erie Canal was built, there was no way to quickly move from town to town. And again, there really weren't these towns that had the prosperity necessary to allow for these kind of social movements to take place. So the Erie Canal really played an integral role in helping something like the women's rights movement really take off. Another movement that appeared around the same time as the women's rights movement was the abolition movement. Abolition was all about ending the practice of slavery in the United States. Now, New York would be a state that did get rid of or ban slavery before it became banned nationally. But even with the ban in New York State, there was still a majority of the country that believed or at least enabled the practice of slavery to continue. One of the ways that abolitionists sought to undermine slavery was to create things like the Underground Railroad and help slaves escape their captivity and go to free states in the North, or maybe even further to Canada, where slavery was also not allowed. The idea is that they're running away from the slave owners that would keep them in subjugation and maybe track them down as well. So the Underground Railroad was a secretive operation. And the Erie Canal played a very big role in that. If you look at the map that I have, these red lines indicate different paths on the Underground Railroad. And for New York State, you can see that it very closely follows the waterways. The one red line that runs from the Great Lake region, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, to the right side of the screen, which would be where Albany is, the capital of New York State, that's the Erie Canal. So people would come up and they'd escort these slaves up through a place like Virginia, up through a place like Ohio, Pennsylvania. They'd make it to Lake Erie, and then they would take a boat all the way up the lake and then into the Erie Canal. And on the Erie Canal, there would be different safe houses, different people trying to help these enslaved people out. and they would help either establish them in New York State or again help them continue onto their journey to Canada if that's where they so desired. So the Erie Canal played a very big role in again transporting people and supporting the idea of abolition. One lesser known aspect of the Erie Canal is the impact it had on various religious movements. New York State has actually been a very big region for religious ideas and utopian societies. The first mass outpouring of religious fever was known as the Great Awakening. This occurred between kind of 1730, 1755. The Second Great Awakening took place around 1790 to 1840. And if you've been paying attention to the dates, this is right when the Erie Canal is being built and finished, with 1825 being right in that kind of middle range for this Second Great Awakening. Many of the leaders as well that participated in the women's rights movement and the abolition movement were religious. The most notable of them were Quakers, Quakers being famously peaceful and against violence in any form. But a lot of different religions popped up in New York State around this time. Some of them are listed here: the evangelical sects, millennialists, new religious groups such as the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, which would be founded in New York State around this time, and then eventually make their way to Utah, as well as Seventh-day Adventists. All of these were started in New York State during this period. And again, just like the women's rights movement, just like the abolition movement, the Erie Canal is allowing for people to move around and spread these religious ideas in a way that they previously had never been able to do before. Instead of, again, having to rely on these slow methods of transportation, these slow methods of communication, now these evangelicals can get out and preach the word of their Bible, the word of their Lord, at a much faster pace than they could before and to a much wider audience. And that meant that they could attract more people and grow these religious communities. And there were so many religious communities that New York was called the burned over district, because there were simply so many that it was becoming almost out of hand. Again, as we talk about these different social movements, it's important to remember that while this is all going on, the Erie Canal is still remaining profitable. And that's important too, because a lot of these movements are relying on income from the profits of the Erie Canal. They've got investments in the canal. And as you can see from this graph, you have a very high amount of revenue compared to the spending that you would and the expenditures for the canal, all the way basically up until the American Civil War. In 1861, you see it just completely drops. Again, that's because the country is focused on much bigger issues. Abolition becomes right at the forefront of the American public, and we do have a civil war over it. That becomes very bloody, and that takes away a lot from the economic growth. But as you can see, it really struggles to recover. In 1855, you have a record of 33,000 commercial shipments in that year, and you see record profits from it. But it's an immediate decline with the war right after, and it never bounces back. It attempts to, in the early 1900s, they try to do things like getting rid of tolls, which was a big source of income for them. But the idea was you get rid of tolls, maybe more people will use the canal because they won't have to pay for it anymore. That didn't really work, though. And as you can see, the revenue tapers off as the years go on, and the expenditures become much more than the revenue, and the canal essentially just starts losing money until you get to the mid 20th century, where it just becomes basically a sinkhole for money. There are a couple different reasons why the Erie Canal really fell off in terms of profit, growth, and success. But really the biggest reason is the thing that was behind the initial success of the Erie Canal, and that's simply technological advancements. Technology had simply surpassed what the Erie Canal was capable of. The big thing in particular was the railroad. Just 1 year after the Erie Canal was finished in 1925, in 1926, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad was chartered in Schenectady, New York, and its entire purpose was basically to undermine the Erie Canal and create a faster method of transporting people from Schenectady to Albany, New York, which was, again, really what the initial design for the Erie Canal was as well. By 1931, the railroad company had opened its first steam engine track and it really started taking off. These engines were much faster and much cheaper in terms of ticket costs than something like the Erie Canal could provide. I think it's very ironic as well that they called the first steam engine the DeWitt Clinton, which DeWitt Clinton would be known as Governor Clinton, and he was the one that really pushed the Erie Canal and got the funding to build it. And it was his pet project. And then the railroad companies kind of ironically call what would be the competitor to the Erie Canal, they name it after him. So I've always found that a little funny. The Mohawk and Hudson Railroad would quickly be combined into a series of other railroads through things like purchasing, expansion, and consolidation. Erastus Corning, who would become the president of these different railroad companies, would form an entirely new one called New York Central Railroad. New York Central would go on to dominate the transportation industry, especially in New York and the Midwest. The company would lay over 11,500 miles of track. It would be in 12 different states. It'd be in Canada as well. Its only competition would be the Pennsylvania Railroad, which would really dominate Pennsylvania. And under Rockefeller, the New York Central Railroad Company was actually the most profitable company in the entire United States. So it was really, really wealthy, and it was really dominating the region. And that includes both passengers as well as goods, like foods, moving furniture, shipment, manufactured goods, all of these things that the Erie Canal used to do, the railroad is now doing at a faster and cheaper cost. So obviously that's taking away business from the Erie Canal and putting them in an even more dire economic situation. The real killing blow actually were trucks. With the creation of the interstate system, especially after World War II, when it was really created and fully established, the Erie Canal just couldn't keep up. It was somewhat keeping up with the railroads because they already had an established area that they operated in the Erie Canal, and the railroad still needed time to build into these places. The rivers and the canals could go into places that the railroad simply could not. So the canal was able to still function on that. But with trucks, they could go into places that both railroads and the canal could not go to. They could transport a lot of goods at a time, and they could do so even more cheaply than even the railroad could. So if the railroad cannot keep up, the canal had no hope at keeping up. So the creation of the interstate system and the modern truck fleet that would come with it killed not just the Erie Canal, but also the big railroad companies, with the Erie Canal fading away in the 1950s and New York Central, again, what used to be the most profitable company in the United States, filing for bankruptcy in 1968 and being bought out by its competitor, only for both of them to file for bankruptcy just 4 years later in 1972. So trucks really brought a whole new game to transportation. While the Erie Canal basically stopped having any major amounts of cargo being moved on it, that does not mean that it just completely vanished from New York State. There have been efforts to kind of boost up the canal, to renovate it, to redo it, to make it much nicer. In 2000, the United States Congress created the Erie Canal National Heritage Corridor. This basically made the Erie Canal protected land. That includes the 34 historic sites that are located along the various routes of the Erie Canal. The biggest thing that the Erie Canal does now is tourism. $1.3 billion a year is generated from tourism related to the Erie Canal. And that's a lot of money. And it's important because 70% of all New York State residents live within 25 miles of the canal. the canal is still a very viable source of income for a lot of New Yorkers who rely on it in maybe not the same exact ways as they did in 1825 when the canal first opened, but it's still a very present part in their lives. So a lot of this is done by kind of tour boats, small cruise ships, boats for hire, and privately owned pleasure boats. And you can see an example of one of these in the image that I have. The lock system is used over 85,000 times a year, and there's still 750 miles of navigable water that the canals connect with. So it really is still a vibrant part of New York State. One thing that's also really important to mention is the presence that the Erie Canal has in terms of our natural environment. For one, a lot of the agricultural areas, especially that are in central New York and around the Finger Lakes region, rely on the water transported by the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal and the New York State Canal system accounts for 40% of all of the New York State fresh water. And that is a lot of the fresh water, and that's what a lot of these farms rely on, and it's also what a lot of animals rely on. So water quality, resource management, environmental protection have become really important as the Erie Canal has entered this kind of new later stage role in society. Another aspect of it is hydroelectricity. There's 27 hydroelectric facilities that operate on the Erie Canal. This can power 54,000 homes right now, but more facilities continue to be built. So potentially down the line, you could see a lot more renewable energy being powered by the Erie Canal, which is again something that really was never an intention for the Erie Canal, but the canal has adapted itself to fit with modern society. And I think to end it, this presentation on is that, New York State would look very different if we did not have the Erie Canal, both in 1825 and today. Over these past 200 years, the Erie Canal has played a continuous and important part in the fabric of New York State history, and it's one that really shouldn't be forgotten. So that is the end of the recorded lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and please don't forget about your assignment due tomorrow.